Hello, everyone, and today we are going to be talking about Module 28 in your World History textbook, Modern Africa, which is going to be lessons 136 through 139. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Let's start with European colonization. Now, Europeans for the longest time called Africa the Dark Continent, both because of the skin color of its people and because we didn't know much about Africa before the 1800s. It was largely a mystery to Europeans. Most of the contact was at things like trading posts along the coasts. Now, between 1870 to 1914, pretty much all of Africa except for Liberia and Ethiopia came under European control. Not only did Europeans fight the people living here, but they also fought other European countries for the territory. Countries like Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Great Britain all fought over this African territory. Now, Europeans had several motivations for colonizing Africa. These included primarily national prestige and economic advantage. Both resources and territory were sought to gain some type of advantage over these other European countries. They wanted to find minerals and other resources that would increase their wealth. They also wanted to use these colonies as an outlet for their goods that were manufactured in their homelands. A few people tried to build personal empires here. Some spiritual and humanitarian concerns also played a role. Many people wrongly considered the African people to be primitive, big quotation marks there, and in need of Western civilization, including things like the Christian faith, whenever it was simply just a difference in cultures. Now, whenever we talk about the first explorations of Africa, these took place along the coast and then moved up rivers to the inner parts of Africa. These trips were often costly in terms of sickness and death. Explorers often encountered what would be considered new diseases, such as malaria and yellow fever. Once cures were discovered for these late in the 19th centuries, Europeans were able to move more confidently into the interior of this continent. Now, when it comes to a discussion of Africa, it's easiest to explain changes based upon location. So we're going to start by talking about North Africa. For North Africa, which extends from the Mediterranean coast to the Sahara Desert, it was primarily conquered by Muslims during the early Middle Ages, with the Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s. The Muslim people profoundly influenced North African life and culture. Now, as Ottoman control weakened around the late 1700s, Egypt and other North African countries were able to function as independent states for a little while. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 sparked a civil war, and a man named Muhammad Ali, leader of the Egyptian resistance to France, gained control in 1805. Muhammad Ali primarily sought to modernize Egyptian agriculture, education, and military. Now, this was paid for by European investors. These European investors put pressure on political leaders during this period of time to pursue policies Europeans thought would bring about repayment. A French company during this time in Egypt also began building the Suez Canal in 1859. Investments from Britain during the 1870s led to Britain taking control of the country in 1882. These investments were made because the country was unfortunately in a state of debt. Once Britain took control of Egypt in 1882, Egypt continued to have a government, but Britain was a significant influencer. However, this is whenever great achievements did occur, such as the dam being built on the Nile for irrigation purposes took place. Egyptian debts were paid off. But many Egyptians resented this foreign influence. France, on the other hand, conquered Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco in West Northern Africa. The French encouraged European settlement to Algeria, and this led to about 1 million people immigrating over there. There was some bickering over these acquisitions, such as Britain and France bickering over who truthfully owned Egypt and who truthfully owned Morocco, but each ended up recognizing the other's governments during this period of time, so about the early 19th century. Italy tried to gain control of Ethiopia, but was only able to control a small part of East Africa. My PowerPoint says West Africa, but it's actually East Africa. I apologize. They succeeded in taking over Libya in 1912 to prevent the French from spreading further eastward. The maneuverings in North Africa during the early 20th century were part of the competition for some form of a political advantage that led up to World War I. As we remember, World War I was very much an arms race of which country was best, which country had the most power, things like that. Now, over in Central Africa, the main contact for Europeans and Africans was via the slave trade in the mid-1400s. African societies had practiced slavery, so the sale to Europeans was just another business deal. Europeans often traded guns for slaves, and the slave trade increased greatly when colonies in North America and the Caribbean islands became dependent on slave labor for plantations. What this generally happened was that the Europeans would trade guns for slaves, and those guns would then be used to get more slaves. Now, the abolishment of slavery in the early 1800s by Great Britain and the United States meant that this source of profit disappeared, and many tribes turned to agriculture to fulfill those lost incomes, selling things like cotton and cacao beans to other countries. Now, a Muslim uprising in the region, actually in the late 1800s and in the early 1800s, ended up increasing the influence of Islam in that region. But in talking about Central Africa, we do have to also talk about the Congo. King Leopold of Belgium took personal control of the Congo Free State in the late 1800s. Leopold sold the rights to rubber and mineral resources to European countries for more power. And these rights were further sold to companies, which unfortunately exploited African workers mercilessly. Christian mercenaries worked to help expose these conditions and to help the people that were in these conditions. And by 1906, the Belgian government stepped in and took over the area as what was known as the Belgian Congo. Now, Spain, Germany, Portugal, and Britain all claimed colonies over in West Africa, but the largest portion of the region was controlled by France. In Eastern Africa, during the 1700s, Arab traders used African slaves to carry gold and ivory to coastal ports. After challenges to these Arab traders, Europeans moved in and presented themselves as protectors of these actual African leaders who were challenging these Arab traders. Many tribes looked to these Europeans for some form of protection from these different traders. In 1884 and 1885, there was a conference of European nations that was held in Berlin to divide up Africa amongst the nations claiming to have an interest in there. This conference was planned to settle disputes and to help the colonial powers concentrate on controlling their assigned regions and gaining the economic benefits that they believe awaited them there. In general, European countries ruled their colonies with little input or involvement from their native population. These governments sought to extract all of the wealth that they could find in these countries, and much of these profits went to Europe. The Europeans brought and often imposed their culture, their business practices, their educational systems. Some jobs were provided to these Africans, but there was a definite loss of native culture from this exchange. Christian missionaries did bring the gospel to Africa, and many natives were converted to Christianity. A few Africans actually began receiving educations in Europe and gained a new vision for what their homeland could be. They wanted to secure freedom for their people. At the same time, some Europeans were arguing for an end to colonialism and to colonization itself. During the 20th century, all African colonial nations became independent. Some formed through violence, while others gained independence more peacefully. This has not brought an end to problems. They've still had to deal with dictators, insufficient government, disease, and more. But they are independent now for the most part. Let's go ahead and let's talk about Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the oldest independent nation in Africa and has a significant role in the making of modern Africa. People from the kingdom of Sheba, whenever it comes to how Ethiopia was founded, generally most archaeologists believe that people from the kingdom of Sheba likely migrated across the Red Sea to Ethiopia. This established the kingdom of Axum there. The kingdom of Axum is actually mentioned in Greek texts. And Christianity was accepted by 333 AD, with the founding of what became known as the Abyssinian Church, or the Ethiopian Orthodox Union Church. And this was the official state church of Ethiopia until 1974. After the rise of Islam in the 600s, Muslims began to capture portions of the Aksumite kingdom. Now, Muslim people did not capture Ethiopia, but remained in authority in some areas, such as the southeast. There was a lot of different dynasties that went through. The Zagwe dynasty removed the Solomonids from power in the 1100s, but the Solomonids began to regain control in the next century. These are different portions of Muslims back in that day. Now, the Portuguese began exploring the coast of Africa in the 1400s and were invited to help Ethiopia resist a Muslim invasion in the first half of the 1500s. Together, they defeated the Muslim attackers by 1543, and Catholic missionaries actually came to Ethiopia. But most Ethiopians maintain attachment to their Abyssinian heritage as a vital part of their independent culture. The 1600s brought a flourishing of artistic expression, and stronger European influence came to Ethiopia in the mid-1800s, with Britain and later Italian presence. Ethiopia began to reunite under their ruler Menelik II by about 1889. Menelik and the Italians agreed to a treaty of friendship, but the translations of the two treaties were interpreted differently, and communication issues led to war between 1895 and 1896. Ethiopian forces prevailed here, and Emperor Lige Iyasu ruled during World War I. During this time, though, a man named Tafari Makon deposed him and placed his aunt as Empress Zaditu. Makon ruled as Haile Selassie after Zaditu died in 1930. Now, during this point in time, World War II was about to kick up, and Mussolini was ruler of Italy. Mussolini defeated Selassie, but Britain and Ethiopia worked together to put him back on the throne by 1941. He stayed in power until 1974, whenever he was removed from power for a communist state led by a man named Mengistu Haile Mariam. By 1991, Haram had been driven from power, and a new government was established by Meles Zenawi. Border disputes after World War II led to war between Ethiopia and Eritrea in the late 1990s. Eritrea and Ethiopia, after World War II, were pretty much were supposed to be like a region together, but there was much bickering because the Eritreans had long sought independence, which they declared in 1993. Therefore, once they were declared, there was a question of where the border was between Eritrea and Ethiopia, leading to that border war. Now, today, the people of Ethiopia have much more in common, with other African countries. Conflicts between Muslims and Christians, conflicts between different ethnic groups, European colonialism, communist expansion, and economic difficulties, just to name a few things that they have in common. Ethiopia's new government seeks to offer opportunities for the new people, and about nearly half of the population of Ethiopia currently is under 15. So the country has so much potential for growth. Ethiopia itself is a federation of 9 regions, each being a home to one of the major ethnic groups in the country. In Ethiopia, a president serves as chief of state, and a prime minister serves as head of government. After separating from Eritrea, Ethiopia is completely landlocked. Many work in agriculture, and Ethiopians really want to increase their industrial sector. They're working with coffee being a major commodity, and business ties between China and Africa have grown significantly since the early 2000s. Let's go ahead and talk about the culture of the Maasai. The Maasai are an East African tribe that has held on to their long-standing traditions in the face of modern challenges. The Maasai are a nomadic tribe that lives in what they call Maasailand, which extends across southern Kenya and north-central Tanzania. I don't actually remember how far it is. I apologize. These people are semi-nomadic, pasturing herds of cows all across the open savanna. This has brought them into conflict with national parks, and some governments who have tried to make them live in permanent settlements. They are one of 40 ethnic groups within Kenya and one of 120 in Tanzania. Historically, the Maasai were a united and powerful people with fierce warriors. Over the centuries, the Maasai spread into the grasslands of the Great Rift Valley. The Maasai themselves have 16 subtribes and live in a basic social and economic unit called a Manyatta, with several families living near one another. The roles in a Maasai family are heavily subdivided and change as the Maasai age. They have initiation rites for both males and females. Males themselves are divided into 5 clearly defined age groups: child, junior warrior, senior warrior, junior elder, and senior elder. Men don't marry before they're 30 years old because they must have served as a warrior and have to have the ability to support a family. Young warriors generally use blunted arrows to hunt smaller birds. These birds are stuffed, tied to a frame, and worn as a headdress. Beating patterns identify the individual's place in the social order, and young men often paint their bodies with ochre for decorations, for example. The basic food of the Maasai is fresh or curdled milk. They will decorate long gourds and use them to store and carry this milk. On special occasions, they'll drink blood drawn from the jugular vein of a bull or a cow without killing the animal, for example, because these bulls or cows are considered to be sacred to them. The meat that they eat usually comes from goats or sheep. They will rarely slaughter bulls and cows, but when they do, it's generally for ceremonial purposes, and every part of it will be used. Now, the Maasai today, they generally are one of the few indigenous peoples who have largely retained their traditional way of life. Some have increased this as a way to promote tourism, and because they live on such a limited income, they use creative means to capitalize on their widely recognized cultural identity. So let's go ahead and to end this, let's talk about South Africa now. South Africa has seen the most changes, from European exploration to colonization to ethnic divisions and conflict and resolution of said conflict, amongst other changes. When it comes to understanding how it got started, anthropologists believe that Africans migrated into the region over 1,000 years ago with the Bantu people. The Dutch founded the colony of Cape Town as a rest stop for Dutch trading ships, and they came to dominate the area, enslaving some while pushing other Bantu to the barren north. The early 1800s were a time of transition and conflict in South Africa, with Britain seizing the colony during the 1800s, and at the same time, a tribe of Bantu known as Zulus created their own empire. Now, the Dutch, called Boers, resented British rule and undertook a migration to the northeast of Cape Colony. Now, this wouldn't be a bad thing, except for it was an area claimed by the Zulu people, leading to conflict between the two groups. Britain aided the Dutch, and by 1897, the Zulu people were defeated. Now, even though they did help, the Boers were threatened by the British for two primary reasons. Because valuable minerals were found in the area, many prospectors flooded into the territory to seek their own fortune. And then second, a man named Cecil Rhodes' vision was to connect North and South Africa. And this included taking over what were Boer-controlled lands. This led to what was known as the Boer War in 1899. And this Boer War lasted for about 3 years until the Boers were defeated and folded back into the Union of South Africa by 1910. Originally, they said that they would give the Boers self-rule, but they were folded into that union by 1910. And this Union of South Africa combined all of Britain's colonies into a single unit as part of the British Empire. And in 1931, the Union of South Africa became a member of the British Commonwealth. Now, what's important to note during this whole period of time is that Black South Africans were generally relegated to lower-paying jobs and strict social segregation. Only white people could vote. Black people had to carry passes even to travel to certain urban areas. British whites and Boer whites, which were called Afrikaners as a group, struggled between themselves for power. Between 1910 and 1948, Afrikaner political leaders portrayed Black Africans as dangerous and won control of whites-only government by 1948. This led to a strict policy of what were known as apartheid laws. Apartness or segregation is what apartheid means, by the way. Amongst races that was already custom, but now it was put into law. And non-white South Africans generally did not see the prosperity that was found in the region. South Africa is almost twice as large as France. It's blessed with an abundant fertile land and natural resources, but these non-white South Africans didn't really get a chance to see it. About 80% of South Africans are Black. Whites and other racial groups comprise about 9% each. And those other racial groups were often also subject to apartheid laws. This segregation hurt the domestic economy and gave the country harsh criticism from other nations. Now, what was known as the African National Congress was a group that worked for Black equality, sometimes utilizing violence with occasional on both sides. with occasional military raids in a neighboring country where ANC terrorists were thought to be hiding. Nelson Mandela, who was an ANC leader, was sent to prison in the early 1960s for his part in said violence. One proposed solution to this question of racial separation was the creation of areas in South Africa that Black people could live, continuing this cycle of white South Africans telling the Bantus where they could and could not live. During the 1980s, international pressures were matched by increased domestic violence, leading to a strike by 2 million Black South African workers in June of 1988. A new constitution was formed in 1983 that allowed Blacks to vote in parliamentary elections in South Africa. With the introduction of laws against interracial marriage were struck down, and the ANC was no longer banned as of 1990, and apartheid was ended, with those new homelands dissolved. With this change, because of international pressures and the domestic violence present, with these changes in place, that all reduced. By 1994, 62% of the vote went to ANC candidates. And in 1995, a group called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to help the country recover from the effects of human rights abuses from apartheid. Nelson Mandela was also freed from prison during this time, and he actually became a leader for this new South African government. Excuse me. Now, unfortunately, this has not stopped some of the issues that are still present in South Africa. For example, the main issue within South Africa currently is there is a form of a HIV/AIDS crisis right now. South Africa has the largest infected population for HIV/AIDS in the world, with by the early 2000s, about 20% of South African adults were infected with HIV/AIDS. But things are much better there than they had been in the past. And with that, that's about what I have for you guys this week. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email or call me, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your day.